The September 11th attacks were a devastating blow for all Americans, especially for New Yorkers like myself. Across the United States, the collective psyche of the country had been impacted. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, America no longer felt secure from outside threats, and for the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, had seen the devastation a foreign adversary could have on American soil. But it could have gone far, far worse. Yes, most of us have heard of the fourth plane hijacked, which was intended to strike either the Capitol building or the White House, only to be commandeered by the passengers from the hijackers and crash into a field in rural Pennsylvania. But that's not what we're referring to today. The plans for the 9/11 attacks had their roots in an earlier terrorist plot that had failed to manifest, but had it succeeded, would have had far more severe and wider-reaching consequences, not just for the United States, but the world at large. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Now before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone who has donated to us on Patreon and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Having dealt with demonetization and even censorship in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, support from our patrons and donors helps make regular videos possible. Every donation goes a long way to keeping our channel going, and as a show of thanks, if you donate to help support the channel, you'll gain access to some great perks, including physical merchandise, a custom-designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos, or just chat with me in the community directly. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, go to the description or comment section to visit our Patreon page and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button next to the subscribe button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, please consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. The foundations for what would later become the 9/11 attacks began with what was known as the Bojinka Plot. The plot was a three-phase operation which federal officials described as hours of continuous terror. Financed by Osama bin Laden, the plot was developed by engineer Ramzi Youssef, one of the men behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Youssef had devised the Bojinka Plot with the intention of assassinating the Pope during his visit to the Philippines in January of 1995. Following this, he planned to have his agents board around a dozen US-bound flights from around Asia, planting explosives on each one, causing them to explode in mid-air near simultaneously. Finally, in a segment of the plot devised by both himself and his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they planned to hijack at least another 10 planes for the purpose of crashing 9 of them to major buildings across the United States, including the Twin Towers, and even intended on striking a number of nuclear facilities to cause nuclear meltdowns, while landing the final plane and killing all its male passengers in a broadcasted act of terror in which the attacks would be called a response to America's continued support for Israel. Responding to the 9/11 attacks had been a rallying point for many Americans and unified the country against a common enemy. It gave the US just cause to launch its war on terror, overthrow the government of Iraq, and invest in a 2-decade-long occupation of Afghanistan. But imagine what the response might have been if the destruction inflicted on America was tenfold. Not only that, but how would the world react to the assassination of the Pope? In our world, the plot was exposed and both Youssef and his uncle fled the Philippines before they could put their plan into motion. Youssef would be captured and arrested while his uncle went on to become the chief architect of the 9/11 attacks. But this time, things are different. On January 15th of 1995, Pope John Paul II on his way to San Carlos Seminary is assassinated in an explosion caused by a terrorist disguised as a priest. John Paul II would be the first pope to die in such a violent fashion in centuries. Immediately, there is widespread mourning and sadness across the Catholic world, while the search for those responsible begins. But this would only be phase 1 of the plot, and was only intended to distract the public long enough to implement phase 2, a strike at the true target of the plot, the United States. On January 21st, multiple planes would near simultaneously explode en route to the United States, causing approximately 4,000 deaths, most of which would be Americans with a good deal of travelers from various East Asian countries. Phase 3 was anticipated to be implemented immediately following and would see a series of hijacked planes crash into the White House, the Capitol, the Pentagon, the Twin Towers, Sears Tower, US Bank Tower, Trans-American Pyramid, CIA headquarters, the J. Edgar Hoover Building, and multiple nuclear facilities on the West Coast. The immediate death toll from these attacks alone could be expected to reach around 20,000, and if nuclear facilities were struck, causing a contamination of the surrounding areas, that death toll would continue to rise. This is not even mentioning diseases that would manifest in the aftermath of these attacks as had occurred for 9/11 survivors and first responders. Among the dead would be several politicians, likely including several senators and congressmen, and potentially then President Bill Clinton if the White House was struck without warning. Most likely, the president and his vice president would have been evacuated to separate secure locations once news had been received of the overseas plane explosions or the subsequent strikes on domestic buildings. Finally, one plane would land with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed claiming responsibility for the attacks in a broadcast and killing all the male passengers aboard the plane. Beyond the sheer loss of life, the destruction would send the national and consequently the global economy into a severe fall, even greater than that which followed the 9/11 attacks in our world, and possibly trigger a brief recession. If the presidential chain of command was sufficiently broken with the president, vice president, and speaker of the House having all perished in the attacks, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that martial law would be instated, placing power not in the hands of the next presidential successor, but in the hands of the military. Fear and sorrow would grip the United States, but as it slowly picked itself back up, those intense emotions would burn into a fierce anger. Likewise would be the case for Catholic countries across the globe. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, there was increased scrutiny of Islamic populations within the United States, and even pleas from government officials not to blame the Islamic population as a whole for the actions of the terrorists behind the attacks. But with so severe a blow to the country with such deeply felt outrage, that may not be realistic this time around. Across the US, riots would break out targeting Islamic communities in direct retaliation from the American public. New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois, Maryland, and Virginia would probably see the greatest level of severity given both their larger Muslim populations and the more direct impact these states would have suffered as a result of the attacks. These riots would escalate to full-on pogroms, which would eventually demand the intervention of the National Guard to restore order on the streets, possibly sowing greater divides between the public who sought immediate justice and the government which aimed to maintain peace and order. Public outcry would demand changes to national security policy and to the immigration system. Many of the men involved in plotting these attacks had at one point resided within the United States, and some were even educated in American schools. The significant dropping of barriers to entry for the United States, which had really taken off during the prior Bush senior administration, would be undone, and an intensifying of national surveillance and security would begin. At the government level, the United States would have also assumed a more unforgiving position, but aimed toward international terror groups. Iraq and Afghanistan would still be invaded, but it's quite possible that in this alternate timeline, operations would extend into Iran, Libya, Yemen, Lebanon, and possibly Syria, perhaps even placing Saudi Arabia in a similar position to Pakistan, in which the two remained allied, but the US adopts a more interventionist position in local affairs to crack down on homegrown terror threats. The global war on terror would also certainly see far greater participation from various Catholic countries, particularly Italy, Spain, Portugal, Poland, Austria, Croatia, and the whole of Latin America, with some no doubt coming to view this effort as an avenging crusade which may lead to a greater level of regime change across the Middle East to establish not just pro-democracy governments, but governments which would preserve the rights of Christians within those lands. The states of the Mediterranean would likely set their sights on Libya, which under Gaddafi was seen as a state sponsor of terrorism. This could potentially lead to a reasserting of influence over North Africa by the Mediterranean states of Europe, not to mention seeing greater presence from these countries across various parts of the Middle East, including the largely Christian-free state of Lebanon, helping the region establish a viable Christian state out of South Lebanese territory with the support of Israel. The religious fervor brought to the conflict by these countries, now motivated by more than just mere geopolitics, by framing this as a crusade, could challenge the fervor of jihadist groups who also view the struggle as a holy war. For the United States, the situation could soon be framed as the Middle East as a whole being in need of reform, and might soon adopt a goal of widespread regime change for the purpose of eradicating Islamic fundamentalism and secular regimes seen as supportive to the fundamentalists, namely Iraq and Syria. Israel would likely have a prominent role to play in all of this and would receive far more American funding and support to aid the United States in building a new Middle East. In attempting to intimidate the United States away from further intervention in the Islamic world, the Bojinka Plot might have instead driven the United States far over the edge, leading to domestic persecution of American Muslims by the public, a restricting of immigration by the government, and a far more assertive and extensive foreign policy across the Middle East. The repercussions of the attacks may not have been greatly thought through by the plotters, something especially evident by the lack of consideration for the outrage the Pope's assassination would have fomented, having only treated the move as a distraction without a realization of how much animosity this would generate. But what do you think? What might have happened had the Bojinka Plot succeeded? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the Bojinka Plot, check out Mr. Asian Pie's video on the subject. The US of Z thanks for watching. Mr. Z, out.